Hey, new girl, you look cold. Here, warm up. The words, slick with a cheap, unearned confidence, cut through the low hum of the crowded dining facility at Erie Station. The crowd laughed. A smattering of nervous, complicit chuckles from the surrounding tables of flight line mechanics and junior officers, all turning to watch the small theater of cruelty unfold. Specialist Liam Miller, a man whose swagger was inversely proportional to his rank, held a carton of milk deliberately warmed in the microwave to an uncomfortable temperature. With a flick of his wrist, a white splash of hot liquid arced through the air and slapped against the chest of the woman's sterile, unmarked gray utility uniform. It wasn't boiling, not enough to scald, but it was hot enough to shock, to stain, to humiliate. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or cry out. Her gaze, which had been fixed on the tray of bland, functional food in her hands, slowly lifted. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, met his. There was no anger in them, no fear. There was only a profound, unnerving calm, a stillness that seemed to absorb the insult, neutralize it, and render it meaningless. It was the calm of a deep ocean trench, unbothered by the storms raging on the surface. Her posture remained perfect, a ramrod straightness that spoke of decades of discipline, a bearing so ingrained it was part of her cellular structure. But when the base commander, General Madsen, saw her stance from his corner table, he put down his fork. He didn't recognize her face, but he recognized the stance. It was the posture of command, the quiet defiance of someone who had faced far worse than a cocky specialist with a milk carton. It was a ghost from his past, a memory of impossible odds and unshakable resolve. He saw the way her hands, steady and unblemished by age spots, but lined with experience, carefully placed her tray on the table beside her. She picked up a single, thin paper napkin and began to methodically, precisely dab at the spreading white stain on her chest. Each movement was economical, deliberate, as if she were disarming a bomb, not cleaning a spill. The laughter around them faltered, dying in the face of her monumental indifference. Her silence was louder than any shout could have been. It created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, doubt began to creep into the minds of the onlookers. Miller felt it too, a prickle of unease. He had expected tears or a furious retort, something he could mock. He got nothing. He got a mirror reflecting his own pathetic foolishness. The scene stretched into an eternity of quiet tension. The only sounds the clatter of cutlery and the silent, damning judgment of a woman who refused to be broken. If you believe true strength is measured not in volume, but in composure, and that respect must be earned, not demanded, type competence below. Miller, emboldened by the lingering attention and mistaking her silence for weakness, decided to double down. He couldn't let this non-reaction be the final word. His fragile ego demanded a more satisfying conclusion. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he sneered, his voice a little too loud, betraying his own rising uncertainty. "Or are you just some paper pusher from logistics who's never seen a real flight line? We deal with real stakes out here, lady. This isn't some cushy desk job back in the States." His words were a volley of assumptions, each one a testament to his own narrow worldview. At Aries Station, a remote and unforgiving outpost on the edge of contested airspace, there was a fierce, tribal hierarchy. At the top were the pilots, the jet jocks, the modern-day knights who rode columns of fire into the sky. Below them were the flight crews, the maintainers, the people who kept the billion-dollar machines flying. And at the bottom, in the eyes of men like Miller, were the administrative personnel, the REMPs, the support staff who were seen as little more than background scenery. He had looked at this unassuming woman, with her plain uniform devoid of wings or rank, her hair streaked with distinguished gray at the temples, and slotted her neatly into the lowest box. He saw her as an easy target, a safe outlet for the frustrations and fears that came with living on a knife's edge. He couldn't have been more wrong. Her silence continued, a formidable shield of discipline. The narrator of her mind was not one of anger, but of cold, hard analysis. She was processing the event not as a personal insult, but as a data point, an indicator of a cultural sickness within this command. She saw Miller not as an enemy, but as a symptom of a deeper problem: arrogance breeding complacency, prejudice eroding readiness. This was a flaw in the system, a vulnerability that could be exploited by a real enemy, far more dangerous than a boy with a milk carton. Finally, after a pause that felt like a tactical maneuver, she spoke. Her voice was low, devoid of tremor, and carried an authority that belied her appearance. "Specialist," she said, her eyes still locked on his. "You are making a scene, that was all." The simple, factual statement landed with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an accusation, it was a diagnosis. It shifted the focus from her supposed weakness to his obvious lack of control. From his corner table, General Madsen was no longer just observing. He was acting. He discreetly keyed a command into the secure datapad beside his plate. A personnel file request. He had seen that unshakable calm before, in the fiery aftermath of a failed sortie over enemy territory, in the eyes of a pilot who had just wrestled a crippled ghost of an aircraft back from the brink of oblivion. He was almost certain he knew who this woman was. And if he was right, Specialist Miller had just committed an act of career suicide, so spectacular it would become a legend. The other soldiers at Miller's table, who had been his chorus of laughter, now shifted uncomfortably. They looked away, suddenly finding their mashed potatoes intensely fascinating. They had backed the wrong horse, and the chilling realization was dawning on them that they were standing next to a man who had just insulted a force of nature. The tense silence of the dining facility was shattered not by a human voice, but by the piercing, electronic scream of the base-wide alert klaxon. Red lights flashed across the walls, washing the room in a pulsating, urgent crimson. This was not a drill. The automated voice, calm and synthetic, echoed through the speakers. Condition 1 alert. ESD event in progress. All essential personnel to their stations. Repeat. Condition 1 alert. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Chairs scraped back. Trays were abandoned. The manufactured drama of the milk stain was instantly forgotten, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of a genuine crisis. Adrenaline, clean and pure, washed away all other concerns. Specialist Miller, his face pale, was swept up in the current, his training kicking in. As a communications technician for the Command Operations Center, he was essential personnel. He sprinted from the DFAC, the image of the stoic woman and the cooling puddle of milk on the floor already fading from his adrenaline-soaked mind. In the midst of the scramble, the woman moved with a different kind of energy. She did not run. She walked. Her pace was brisk, efficient, and imbued with a terrifying sense of purpose. She moved against the main flow of traffic, not towards the barracks or shelters, but directly towards the nerve center of the entire base, the COC. A young airman, a security guard no older than 20, saw her approach the blast doors of the command center. He raised his rifle, his face a mask of professional tension. "Ma'am, this area is restricted to authorized personnel only. You need to proceed to the nearest shelter." He was doing his job, following his orders. He saw an unknown woman in a soiled, rankless uniform trying to enter the most secure location on the entire station. Her response was simple. She didn't argue or try to explain. She simply met his gaze and said, "I am authorized." There was a finality in her tone that gave the young guard pause. Before he could respond, the blast doors hissed open from the inside. General Madsen stood there, his face grim. His eyes were not on the guard, but on her. "Let her through," he commanded, his voice cutting through the din of the alarms. "Get her a headset." Now, the guard snapped to attention, his confusion overridden by the general's absolute authority. He lowered his weapon and stepped aside, watching as this mysterious woman walked past him and into the heart of the storm. Inside the COC, a symphony of organized panic was playing out. Men and women moved with practiced speed, their voices a clipped jargon of status reports and technical data. On the main holographic display that dominated the room, a terrifying picture was unfolding. The XR-9 Archangel, the most advanced strategic reconnaissance aircraft in the world, was in catastrophic trouble. It was returning from a deep penetration mission, its stealth systems still active, but it was mortally wounded. A cascading series of system failures had taken out its engines and primary flight controls. The two pilots on board had been forced to eject over a remote, hostile mountain range. The Archangel was now a ghost, a multi-billion-dollar glider filled with America's most sensitive secrets, falling silently and inexorably out of the sky. The woman, whose name no one in the room yet knew, stepped onto the command platform. General Madsen guided her to the primary flight operations console, the God Seat, which was currently manned by a frantic and sweating colonel. "Colonel, stand down," Madsen ordered. The colonel looked up, bewildered, but saw the iron certainty in the general's eyes and immediately vacated the chair. The woman slid into the seat, her movements fluid and sure. Her hands hovered over the complex array of screens and controls for a moment, not in hesitation, but in a kind of silent communion with the machine. Then they began to move. They danced across the keyboards and touchscreens with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. She wasn't searching for menus or reading prompts. She was inputting commands from memory, her muscle memory, so deep it was instinctual. She was speaking the machine's native language. A young lieutenant next to her stammered, "Ma'am, the bird is a dead stick. Total engine failure. The remote uplink is failing, and the landing gear is unresponsive. Our only option is to activate the self-destruct sequence before it goes off base." The woman didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the telemetry data streaming across the screen. "Negative," she said, her voice the calmest in the entire room. "Self-destruct is not an option. That asset is coming home. Patch me into the aircraft's tertiary control bus. I need a direct neural link to the flight control surfaces. Bypass the primary hydraulic actuators and give me direct electrical impulse control." The technician stared at her, dumbfounded. What she was asking for was not just unconventional. It was theoretically impossible. The tertiary bus was a maintenance diagnostic system, not a flight control interface. Using it to fly the plane would be like trying to perform brain surgery with a hammer. Specialist Miller, having arrived at his communications console on the lower level, looked up at the command platform. He saw the woman from the DFAC sitting in the God Seat, issuing commands to colonels and generals. A cold dread, far more chilling than the Condition 1 alert, began to pool in his stomach. He put on his headset to monitor the command channel, and the first thing he heard was her voice, calm and authoritative, cutting through the static. "Override safety protocols Alpha 7 through Delta 9, she commanded. "Give me manual control of the variable camber wing surfaces. I'm going to bleed off speed by inducing a control stall on the main screen." The icon for the XR-9, which had been on a steady, grim descent path, began to behave erratically. It was wobbling, shuddering, but it was no longer just falling. It was being flown. She was wrestling with a ghost, using nothing but trace electrical signals and an intimate, almost supernatural understanding of aerodynamics. She was turning a falling brick into a leaf on the wind, guiding its descent with a touch so delicate it defied physics. The entire command center fell into a deafening, awestruck silence, watching the impossible unfold. The final moments of the XR-9 Archangel's descent were a masterclass in controlled chaos. On the main screen, everyone watched the view from a camera on the runway's edge. The sleek, black shape of the aircraft materialized out of the gray, overcast sky, silent as a phantom. It had no engine roar, only the eerie, whistling shriek of air being sliced by its massive wings. It was coming in too fast, its belly exposed where the landing gear should have been. A collective gasp went through the room. It was going to crash. But the woman at the console was not finished. In the last 100 feet, she made a final minute adjustment, a command that sent the last dregs of power to the wing flaps. The aircraft's nose pitched up ever so slightly, a final, desperate flare. The XR-9 touched down not with a crash, but with a long, grinding scream of metal on concrete. It landed on its reinforced ventral fuselage, a shower of brilliant orange sparks trailing behind it like the tail of a comet. It slid for over a mile, perfectly straight, staying dead center on the runway before finally, gracefully, coming to a complete stop. It was a textbook gear-up emergency landing, a maneuver so difficult and so dangerous that most pilots only ever practiced it in a simulator, and even then, they failed most of the time. She had done it remotely, on a dead-stick aircraft with a failing control system. In the stunned silence that followed, a single, shaky "holy cow" was uttered by a technician. Then, the room erupted. A wave of cheers, applause, and relieved shouts washed over the command center. They weren't just celebrating a saved aircraft. They were celebrating a miracle. In the midst of the celebration, General Madsen walked to the center of the command platform. He held up a hand, and the room slowly fell silent again. His face was like granite, and his eyes scanned the faces of his crew until they found Specialist Liam Miller, who looked like he was about to be physically sick. Madsen tapped a command on his datapad, and the main holographic display flickered, the external runway view replaced by an official military personnel file. A picture of a much younger woman in a flight suit stared out at them. The face was the same. The name on the file read, Hayes, Evelyn M., and below the name, the rank, Admiral. Madsen's voice boomed through the room, each word a hammer blow of revelation. For those of you who are unaware, he began, his voice dripping with icy fury. This is Admiral Evelyn Hayes. Call sign, Ghost. She has over 7,000 flight hours, 3,000 of them in combat. She was the lead test pilot for the XR-9 Archangel program. She didn't just fly this aircraft, she helped design it. She wrote the book on its flight characteristics and its emergency procedures. He paused, letting the information sink in. Then he turned his head slowly, his gaze locking directly onto Miller. Specialist Miller, earlier today, you asked this, paper pusher, if she'd ever seen a real flight line. You should know that Admiral Hayes has forgotten more about high-performance aviation than you will ever learn. The remote flight control system she just used to save our most valuable intelligence asset, she invented it. The belly landing maneuver she just executed, it's not in any of your training manuals because until about 90 seconds ago, the United States Air Force officially classified it as impossible for everyone, that is, except the one person who knew it could be done. The weight of the general's words descended on Specialist Miller like a physical object, crushing the air from his lungs. Every ounce of his bravado, his arrogance, his entire self-image shattered into a million pieces. The woman he had publicly humiliated, the new girl he had treated as less than nothing, was a living legend. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold, clammy sweat breaking out on his forehead. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't even look at the general. He stared at his console, the glowing lights blurring into a meaningless smear. Then, another sound cut through the charged atmosphere. It was the sharp, percussive sound of leather heels snapping together on the metal floor. General Madsen, a 3-star general and the commander of this entire strategic sector, turned to face Admiral Hayes. He drew himself up to his full height, his back rigid, and executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his long and decorated career. It was not a gesture of regulation. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated respect. It was the salute of a warrior acknowledging a master of his craft. Admiral Hayes. Madsen's voice was formal, resonant with reverence. Welcome to Ares Station. Forgive the informal reception. My command is yours for a moment. The room was frozen. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, every single officer and enlisted person in that command operations center, over 100 of them, followed the general's lead. 100 arms snapped up in unison. The sound was like a single, thunderous crack, an explosion of respect that physically echoed off the walls. It was a wave of validation, washing away the stain of the hot milk with a tidal force of honor. They were saluting not just her rank, but her competence. They were saluting the impossible feat they had just witnessed. Admiral Hayes finally looked away from her console. She took in the sea of salutes, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, No hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet weariness, the look of someone who had carried immense responsibility for a very long time. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to General Madsen, a silent acknowledgement from one professional to another. Then, her gaze swept the room and settled, for just a second, on Specialist Miller. He finally forced himself to look up and meet her eyes. He expected to see anger or contempt or satisfaction. He saw none of it. He saw only a deep, profound disappointment, which was infinitely worse. Without another word, she turned her attention back to the crisis at hand. She pressed a button on her headset, her voice once again the epitome of calm professionalism. "Get a fire suppression team and a recovery crew on that bird immediately," she ordered. "I want the intelligence data core secured and delivered to my temporary office in 30 minutes. And give me a full diagnostic report on the cascade failure. I'm going to find out what went wrong." She was already back to work. Her victory was not in the humiliation of her detractor, but in the seamless execution of her duty. Her competence was her only necessary statement. The story of what happened that day spread through Aerie Station not like wildfire, but like a shockwave. It traveled instantly through secure comms channels and hushed, off-field conversations. It became known simply as The Milk and the Ghost. The tale had two parts: the petty act of humiliation in the DFAC and the sublime act of genius in the COC. The contrast was so stark, so poetic, that it immediately cemented itself into the institutional lore of the base. For Specialist Miller, the aftermath was a crucible. He was not court-martialed. He was not discharged. Admiral Hayes, in a quiet word with General Madsen, had requested he receive no official punishment. Instead, she had suggested a different path for him. Miller was reassigned. He was taken off his comfortable, air-conditioned communications console and assigned to the recovery and repair crew for the very XR-9 he had watched her save. His new job was grueling, physical, and humbling. He spent the next 3 weeks on the windswept runway, working under the direct supervision of the master crew chiefs, men who had forgotten more about aircraft maintenance than he had ever known. He scrubbed soot from the fuselage. He helped recalibrate the delicate sensors. He learned the name of every rivet and the purpose of every wire on the machine that served as a constant, looming monument to his own ignorance. He worked with a quiet, furious intensity he had never possessed before. The swagger was gone, replaced by a focused humility. He spoke only when spoken to, and his answers were precise and respectful. He was learning, for the first time, the true meaning of professionalism, not from a textbook, but through the sweat of his brow and the ache in his back. The symbolic artifacts of the event began to appear. The audio recording from the command channel during the landing, the one featuring Admiral Hayes' impossibly calm voice guiding the ghost plane home, was classified, but sanitized clips of it began circulating among pilot training programs. It became the new gold standard for grace under pressure. The section of the runway where the Archangel had skidded to a halt, its surface permanently scarred with long, black streaks of scorched metal, was unofficially nicknamed Ghost Touchdown by the ground crews. And in the main briefing room, a high-resolution photo was hung on the wall, a shot of the XR-9 resting silently on the tarmac, surrounded by emergency vehicles, a testament to the day the impossible was made possible. Admiral Hayes, for her part, deflected all praise. She saw the incident not as a personal victory, but as a teaching moment for the entire command. She observed Miller from a distance, noting his changed demeanor. She recognized that true leadership wasn't about punishing failure, but about cultivating the conditions for growth. Her silence had shamed him, her competence had humbled him, and now her quiet grace was giving him a chance to rebuild himself into something better. The true test of Miller's transformation came several weeks later. The repairs on the XR-9 were nearly complete. It sat in the main hangar, a gleaming black phoenix being prepared to rise from its own ashes. Admiral Hayes was conducting a final inspection before clearing it for its return to service. She walked the length of the aircraft, her eyes missing nothing, her movements as precise and methodical as they had been on the day of the incident. She ran a gloved hand along a newly replaced hydraulic line, her focus absolute. She rounded the massive wing and came face to face with Specialist Miller. He was on his knees, meticulously calibrating the torque on the bolts of the main landing gear door, the very gear that had failed to deploy. He froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the final judgment. He expected a lecture, a final condemnation, a reminder of his monumental failure. He slowly, reluctantly, got to his feet, his hands slick with hydraulic fluid, and stood at a position of attention. The Admiral stopped in front of him. The cavernous hangar was silent save for the distant hum of ventilation fans. She didn't look at his face. She looked at his work. Her gaze followed the lines of the repaired door, the clean seams, the perfectly seated bolts. Then she asked a question. It was not about the DFAC. It was not about his attitude. It was a technical question delivered in her same, calm, professional tone. "Specialist," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space, "what is the specified torque tolerance on those primary actuator bolts?" It was a simple question, but it was everything. It wasn't a trap. It was an opportunity. It was a test of his new self. In that moment, Miller had a choice. He could stammer, apologize, or deflect. Instead, he took a breath. He had spent the last 3 weeks doing more than just manual labor. He had been studying. He had devoured every technical manual on the XR-9 he could get his hands on. He had pestered the crew chiefs with endless questions. He knew the answer. 120 foot-pounds, Admiral, he replied, his voice clear and steady. With a tolerance of plus or minus 2% to prevent stress fractures in the composite housing during high-G maneuvers, he had not just answered. He had demonstrated understanding. He had shown that he had done the work. Admiral Hayes held his gaze for a long moment. Then she gave a single, deliberate nod. "Good work, Specialist," she said, and then she walked away. That was it. No grand speech of forgiveness. No dramatic absolution. Just 2 words. Good work, but for Liam Miller, those 2 words were the most powerful he had ever heard. They were not forgiveness for his past arrogance, but recognition of his present competence. It was permission to move forward, not by forgetting his mistake, but by learning from it. In that moment, he was no longer defined by his worst moment, but by his response to it. He had been held to a higher standard, and for the first time, he had met it. A year passed. The seasons changed even at the desolate outpost of Ares Station. The biting winter winds gave way to a harsh, sun-bleached summer. The base, however, had undergone a more significant change than the weather. The culture had shifted. The story of the milk and the ghost was no longer just gossip. It had become a foundational myth, a part of the institutional identity of the station. New airmen arriving for their first tour were told the story by their sergeants, not as a joke, but as a deadly serious lesson. "Here at Ares, we don't make assumptions," the old hands would say. "You salute the uniform, but you respect the person wearing it. Because you never know if you're talking to a clerk or to the person who wrote the book on flying, the casual arrogance that had once defined the social hierarchy had been replaced by a quiet, watchful professionalism. The different career fields, pilots, maintainers, support staff, began to interact with a newfound sense of mutual respect, united by the understanding that excellence could be found in the most unexpected places. Liam Miller was now Sergeant Miller. The promotion had been hard-earned, recommended by the very crew chiefs who had worked him to the bone. He was a different man. The loud, insecure boy was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused, and deeply respected non-commissioned officer. He led his own team of communications technicians now, and the first lesson he taught every new recruit was the story of his own greatest failure. He would stand them in front of the picture of the belly-landed XR-9 in the briefing room and tell them about the hot milk, the sneering insults, and the crushing weight of his own ignorance. He turned his personal humiliation into a powerful teaching tool, ensuring that the next generation would not make the same mistake. His penance was not punishment, but mentorship. Admiral Evelyn Ghost. Hayes was long gone. She had stayed at Ares Station for only a few weeks, overseeing the investigation into the XR9 system failure before being reassigned to another, even more critical command. She left as quietly as she had arrived, with no fanfare or formal farewell. But her legacy remained, etched into the very soul of the base. It wasn't in a statue or a plaque with her name on it. It was in the changed attitudes of thousands of service members. It was in the quiet competence she had modeled. It was in the second chance she had given a young man who had wronged her. Her legacy was the living, breathing culture of respect that she had forged in the crucible of a single, extraordinary day. It proved that true leadership isn't about the power you wield, but about the standards you inspire in others. The true measure of a legacy is not what is written on a stone monument, but what is carried forward in the hearts and actions of those who remain. The stain of hot milk on a uniform was temporary, a fleeting insult washed away with soap and water within the hour. But the stain of arrogance on a man's character, the stain of prejudice on an institution's culture, those are far more difficult to cleanse. They require a powerful, abrasive truth to scrub them away. On that day at Ares Station, Admiral Hayes provided that truth. Her quiet competence was the solvent that dissolved Miller's ignorance. Her impossible act of skill was the moral clarifier that revealed the worthlessness of superficial judgments. The contrast was absolute. A childish, petty act of disrespect in the mess hall versus a profound, masterful act of responsibility in the command center. One was an attempt to tear someone down. The other was an act of lifting everyone up, of saving lives, of protecting secrets, of preserving a vital national asset. One was noise, the other was signal. In the end, the story teaches us that assumptions are the termites of any strong organization, silently eating away at the foundations of trust and respect until the entire structure is ready to collapse under the slightest pressure. True strength is not found in the volume of your voice, but in the precision of your actions. It is not announced with a trumpet, but demonstrated in the deafening silence of a crisis overcome. It is the steady hand in the storm, the calm voice in the chaos, the quiet professional who does the job not for applause or recognition, but because the job must be done. The world is full of loud, arrogant Millers, quick to judge and eager to belittle. But it is the quiet, competent Hayes who hold it all together, who land the impossible planes, who solve the unsolvable problems, and who, by their silent example, teach us the true meaning of worth. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance, and where silent precision defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.